Alzheimer's is one of the most terrifying and saddening diseases a person can experience. Just imagine everything we know about life and the world, everything. Running around as a kid, raising our hand in class, listening to our friends talk, even who our friends are, our partner, children, or anyone else, it all fades away. It's as if it never happened. And it's even more painful when it happens to someone we love. How heartbreaking it is to lose someone when their body is still right in front of us. It's as if they're no longer the person we've always loved. And all of this happens because of our brain, at least biologically and neurologically. The human brain is nature's greatest gift, but that doesn't mean its flawless feature. The human brain controls many important functions necessary for survival, from using our senses to monitor the environment, controlling our breathing rhythm, to keeping our heartbeat stable. The brain also stores our thoughts and memories. We rely heavily on its ability to process information in more elaborate stages. Our brain is the only tool that provides us with a picture of reality. The strange thing is, its vital functions happen automatically without requiring our conscious awareness. When we remember something, our brain goes through 3 processes: learning the information or encoding, storing it or storage, and retrieving it when needed or retrieval. Forgetting can happen at any one of these stages, and it can occur at any time. In daily life, forgetting can often feel annoying, especially as we get older. It feels more terrifying and saddening, but in reality, forgetting is a natural part of how memory works. In fact, because we can forget, our brains have space to absorb and learn new things. In the end, everything will be forgotten. Sooner or later, the human fear of losing collective memories like history, trauma, or traditions makes us try to reconcile forgetting by painting, writing, and creating archives. But what exactly is forgetting? Why can we clearly remember one moment while others just fade away as if they never happened? Does forgetting mean the memory truly disappears from the brain? Or is it just hidden and inaccessible? Why are our memories often incorrect? It's even possible to create events that never actually occurred. Can we purposely forget something? And if so, why does the brain choose to forget? Is forgetting always a failure? Or is it actually an important function to maintain sanity and survival? What is the relationship between memory, imagination, and identity? And in the end, when everything is forgotten, what is truly left of who we are? From embarrassing moments in life to everyday details, many memories have been forgotten. How and why do certain memories fade while others stay clear throughout life? There are 2 simple answers to this question. First, the memory has disappeared and is no longer available in our mind. Second, the memory is still stored in the memory system, but for some reason, it cannot be retrieved. Sometimes, an experience is stored in memory and then becomes difficult, even almost impossible to recall. We can only speculate whether that experience has truly disappeared from the memory that once held it. The most logical place to start looking into forgetfulness is the undeniable reality that anyone, whether human or any organism with a memory system, faces. The more time that passes, the more likely it is that we forget something. While this may not be surprising, there are deeper questions. What exactly is the relationship between memory and time? Do we forget at a constant rate over time? Do memories fade slowly like ink in water? Or do they collapse suddenly like an old wall? Scientists, especially Paul Reber, estimate that the human brain has a capacity roughly equivalent to around 2.5 petabytes of information. That's equivalent to 300 years of non-stop video watching. A staggering number that proves the brain isn't lacking space, but rather, it's like a library without a catalog. The problem isn't just about storage, but about finding what has been stored. We live in a brain that's full, but we don't always know where a particular memory is placed on the shelf, and sometimes we don't even know if that memory is still there. So, if the brain has such a large storage capacity, why do we often forget small things in our daily lives? This opens the door for a deeper question. Does forgetting happen because the information truly disappears, or because our brain simply fails to retrieve it? It turns out that human memory decline doesn't happen evenly over time. This was first proven by Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885 with the concept now known as the forgetting curve. In his research, Ebbinghaus discovered that we tend to forget most of the information we just learned within the first few hours or days. However, after that, the forgetting process begins to slow down and become more stable. This means that the brain does lose a lot of information quickly at first, but after that, it tends to retain the remaining information for a longer period. The pattern is like this. The longer time passes, the less we can remember, unless we repeat or reinforce it. This is known as logarithmic decline, steep at first, then flattening over time. The forgetting process on Ebbinghaus's diagram aligns with the failure to retrieve memories within a certain time frame. Subjectively, perhaps the most convincing evidence that our memory stores information that we cannot access comes from the experience of being asked a question we are sure we know the answer to, yet we cannot express it at that moment. It's as if the answer is on the tip of our tongue. But this raises the question, is this a sign of memory failure or evidence that part of our memory remains hidden, just waiting to be triggered? To answer this question, Roger Brown and David Mill conducted an experiment in 1966. They designed a situation where participants were deliberately provoked to experience the tip of the tongue phenomenon. They did this by reading out definitions of uncommon words. For example, a musical instrument consisting of a frame with metal tubes that are struck with a hammer. The word in question was xylophone. Participants who felt they were experiencing the tip of the tongue were asked to mention anything they remembered about the word, how many syllables it had, the first letter, or any sounds they felt familiar with. Interestingly, the results showed that even though they couldn't recall the word fully, they were more likely to correctly identify its characteristics, rather than just guessing. Even more fascinating, when given the first letter of the word, they could immediately name it. In this example, the letter X was enough to trigger their memory of xylophone. This experiment shows that our memories never truly disappear, but are actually just hidden within our brain's complex system. The tip of the tongue phenomenon seems to prove that our access to memory is partially blocked. It's as if the word stands behind a thin curtain. We can sense its presence, but can't quite name it. Our brains store far more than we can immediately access. A research team from the University of Southern California tested a baby zebrafish, which is only half the size of a pea, to understand how the fish remembers and forgets. The researchers taught the zebrafish to associate bright light with a flash of heat, a temperature change that the fish responded to by attempting to swim away. Using a specially designed microscope, the team captured images of the fish's brain just before and after they learned to associate light with heat. This experiment marked the first known technique to understand how the brains of vertebrates physically restructure themselves when forming memories. In the images published by the research team, bright yellow dots represent new synaptic connections formed between brain cells as memory is created. Meanwhile, overlapping blue dots indicate synaptic connections that were broken. It's as if old memories disappear to make room for new ones. These images capture the moment when the brain literally restructures itself, forming and deleting neural connections in the process of learning and remembering. Just like in the zebrafish's brain, we too harbor the same paradox. The brightest flaw in human memory is its mortality. Slowly but surely, the past never disappears dramatically, but fades quietly, replaced by the presence of new experiences. The memories of our episodes are filled with distortions, neglect, elaboration, and various other memory flaws. A lot of our memories turn out to be wrong. We often see events that never really happened, and even more often, we forget things that should be important. The mechanisms of forgetting that we currently understand in the human memory system are theoretically divided into two main categories: passive forgetting and active forgetting. Both explain how and why some memories gradually fade from our awareness, whether because they are slowly forgotten or actually erased by the memory system itself. Passive forgetting refers to the natural process where a memory fades or becomes difficult to access without conscious effort or direct intervention from us. In other words, it's a form of forgetting that happens automatically as part of our biological and psychological dynamics. This process doesn't involve a conscious desire to forget. In general, passive forgetting includes three main forms: loss of context. Over time, The cues or context that once helped us make sense of something may fade or become irrelevant. As a result, even though the memory is still stored, we can't easily access it, like a lost key to a cupboard full of memories. Interference during memory retrieval. Memories can collide with each other, disrupting the recall process, which can happen in two ways. Proactive interference, where old information interferes with the process of remembering new information. Retroactive interference, when new information actually blocks access to old information. Natural decay. This is the biological process where memory weakens over time due to the lack of reinforcement or repetition. Synaptic connections that are not often used gradually weaken and eventually break down, like a footpath overgrown with grass because it's rarely used, in contrast to passive forgetting. Active forgetting involves conscious and deliberate processes, either by us psychologically or by the brain through even more hidden biological mechanisms. In active forgetting, the brain actively erases, suppresses, or distorts access to memories, often to protect us from emotional disturbance, or to optimize space for new incoming information, according to Davis and Zoll. There are three main types of active forgetting. Motivated forgetting. A person consciously or unconsciously chooses to forget information they don't want, such as traumatic memories, embarrassing experiences, or unbearable pain. This is a form of psychological protection that prevents us from getting stuck in repetitive suffering. So, we intentionally erase our own memories. Retrieval-induced forgetting. Interestingly, remembering one part of our memory can cause another part to be forgotten. In this phenomenon, when we actively retrieve a certain aspect of a memory, other related parts of the memory are suppressed or blocked, making them harder to access later. Intrinsic forgetting. This is forgetting that happens without conscious will but still remains biologically active. Our brains automatically activate memory erasing cells through certain biochemical pathways to delete information that is no longer relevant. It's like an internal cleaning system that maintains our cognitive balance. However, some people feel detached from this scary reality. These are the people who believe they have photographic memory, the ability to recall past events in detail with high accuracy. Although many people claim to have it, scientists like Elizabeth Loftus, Charles Romier III, Joseph Sortger, John Morton, and others still lack evidence that it really exists. Highly superior autobiographical memory, or HSAM, is a condition that has been identified in fewer than 100 people worldwide. Those who have it can recall their personal life details in an extraordinary way, dates of events and past experiences that most of us have already forgotten in the fog of time. But even though it seems amazing, HSAM is not photographic memory. Their memory is not as perfect as a camera that captures the world with absolute precision. We usually imagine those with HSAM can remember with total accuracy, without mistakes, without gaps, without flaws. However, what actually happens is much more human. Research, like that done by Leopard and his colleagues, and also by Patey and his team a year later, shows that even those with HSAM are still vulnerable to distortions and false memories. Even classic imagery editing studies confirm that our minds tend to add or change visual details unconsciously, even those that seem vivid or clear. Memory is a confusing process, and what we pull out of our brains is not always completely accurate. After all, who would want to store so many memories in their head about everything they've witnessed? And if those with the most remarkable memories among us are still vulnerable to the terrifying distortions of brain events that should be completely natural, imagine how much more susceptible we are, the average people. Remember that our memories can also be wrong. We might think that any detail we've noticed and stored well in our memory will at least be accurate, even if it's incomplete. But in reality, that's not the case. Memory is more metaphorically like children, with wide open eyes, fully believing every princess singing and giant mouse they see in that fantasy world is real. The memories we've formed are highly susceptible to influences from creative editing by our brains, especially during a period of time, hours, days, or longer, when these memories are being consolidated before eventually becoming part of the long-term memories our brains construct. This phenomenon shows the duality in the way our brains work. The brain can be very effective at remembering important things, but it is also highly vulnerable to mistakes in the process. False memory is one of the most striking ironies in human memory work. A memory that feels real but never actually happened on a smaller scale. This false memory may be just a detail, like remembering a different car color or the wrong location in an event. However, at a more severe level, we may fully believe that we experienced an event that never actually took place. This phenomenon is not just a minor mistake. What makes it so dangerous is the emotional certainty that comes with it. We can be so sure that our memory is right, even though objective evidence shows otherwise. This explains why false memories have such a big impact, not just in our personal psychology, but also in social and legal contexts. One of the most tragic examples of false memory happened in the famous McMartin preschool trial in the 1980s in California, USA. The McMartin family, who ran a kindergarten in Manhattan Beach, was accused of hundreds of acts of sexual abuse against children. This accusation started from a single report, but soon grew into a wave of national hysteria. The legal process lasted for 7 years, making it one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in American history. But in the end, no convictions were made. All charges were dropped. Investigations later revealed that most of the statements from the children witnesses were based on suggestive and manipulative questioning, which unknowingly created false memories in their minds. This case shows how our memories can be constructed through outside influences, social pressure, harsh questioning, or even the desire to fill gaps in our personal narratives. False memories, in this context, become more than just cognitive failures. They become tools that create a false reality, causing suffering and ruining the lives of innocent people. In the realm of psychology, this phenomenon is also known by other terms such as memory illusion, paramnesia, or pseudo-memory. Some people call it false memory syndrome, or FMS, especially when the false memory is related to traumatic experiences like sexual abuse. However, the term FMS itself is controversial and not officially recognized in diagnostic systems like the DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Many psychologists prefer more natural terms like recovered memory or distorted memory because they understand how complex and sensitive this area is. In the end, false memories remind us that even when we try to remember something, our minds often insert narratives, assumptions, or even fantasies, weaving them into beliefs so strong that they become hard to tell apart from reality. One of the most famous, and often joked about because it's so popular, even though it's actually serious, is the Mandela effect. This is the phenomenon where a group of people shares a collective memory that's different from the facts or events that actually happened. It originated from many people wrongly remembering that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s. In reality, he died in 2013, after being released for a long time and even served as the president of South Africa. This makes the Mandela effect an example of collective false memory, where it's not just our subjective experience, but somehow everyone shares this memory. Some theories suggest that the Mandela effect is caused by memory mistakes or memories mixed with other information, leading to a kind of convergence of collective memories, where many people share similar but not identical stories, which get socially aligned. While more speculative theories link this phenomenon to the idea of parallel realities, Professor Elizabeth Lafters shows how easily false memories can be created with just a little help from subtle cues or suggestions. In one of her famous experiments, she involved 24 individuals aged between 18 and 53 years old. Each participant was given a small booklet containing narratives about 4 childhood events. 3 of these events were real, confirmed by their relatives. The 4th, however, was a fictional event deliberately created, getting lost in a shopping mall. The false event was carefully designed, mixing general information about family activities at a shopping mall with personal details provided by the family, so the story seemed believable and familiar. The goal was to create a narrative that was suggestive enough to trick the participants' memory. The results were astonishing. About 29% of the participants remembered the fake experience as if it had really happened. In 2 follow-up interviews, 25% of them still believed the false memory. Some even added details that were never part of the original narrative, such as who found them or how they felt at the time. This experiment serves as strong evidence that memory is not an objective recording, but rather a construction that can be influenced by external narratives. Our brains, when faced with gaps or incompleteness in memory, would automatically fill those gaps with assumptions, associations, or even imagination, creating a memory that feels real but never actually occurred. Human memory, often thought of as a precise record of events, is in fact highly vulnerable to distortion and errors in reconstruction. And this is quite frightening, as it makes us question how far this can go. If our memories can be wrong, distorted, or even fabricated, then what is truly left of ourselves? And how much can we still trust that our past truly happened? And if we forget, am I still me? Humans often cannot forget and are always tied to the past. No matter how far they try to move forward, memories, no matter how distorted, continue to follow them. Every moment that has passed, no matter how brief, often returns and influences the moments that follow. Animals, on the other hand, live free from the burden of history. They only exist in the present, leaving no trace, hiding nothing, and experiencing each moment as it is. In De Morio et Menintia, Aristotle offers one of the earliest and most systematic theories on memory. For him, memory is not merely the ability to store information, but something that always includes an awareness of time that has passed. We don't just remember something, we also know that it happened. This is the fundamental difference between perception and memory. While perception is present now, memory is the presence of what has passed. Yes, Aristotle distinguished two main forms of memory: mneme, passive memory, when memories emerge on their own without effort, and the second, anamnesis, active memory, which is a conscious search for a trace of the past. Aristotle's most famous metaphor is the concept of typos, a trace or mark left by an experience on the soul, like a seal left on soft wax. The stronger and more emotional an event, the deeper its trace. But what's interesting is, to access that trace again, we need a mental process involving associations between similarities, contrasts, or time proximity. In other words, we don't recall by pressing a replay button, but by retracing the interconnected thought pathways. Memory isn't perception or conception, but a state or affection of one of them conditioned by the passing of time. This means memory itself comes from sensory experiences or thoughts that happened before, but the trace or impact of those experiences remains in our soul, always carrying an awareness of the time gap, where we know that what we remember has happened, has passed. Imagine if you smelled the scent of cake. You'd probably feel like you've been thrown back to a childhood moment where you smelled that same scent. That's memory. We know it's not happening now, but it's a trace from the past. If it were just the scent, it would be perception. But because it's tied to the passage of time, it becomes memory. Thus, forgetting is the beginning of a search, and memory is the soul's ability to trace back to something that has passed. Spinoza, in Ethics, particularly in Part 2, takes us in a very different direction. For him, time isn't something objective and independent, but rather a way the mind organizes experience. A mental structure he called duratio, which isn't time in a chronological sense like a clock or calendar, but more like an awareness of the continuity of existence. The duration of each thing isn't determined by the thing's own natural properties, but because the mind understands nature as something ordered in a sequence. So one thing is considered first, and another comes after. Even when we imagine its existence as infinite, we still don't understand it as existing simultaneously. What does this mean? Time is an order created by the mind. When we say one thing happened before another, we're actually just building a relationship between ideas that appear in our consciousness. Therefore, time is actually a form of understanding, not external reality. And this is where memory becomes interesting. It becomes a product of the way the mind reorganizes duration, not an objective recording of the world. When we forget, it's not just the information that disappears, but the position of something within our network of consciousness also vanishes. It's not just that we forget someone's name. We forget that they were once a part of our duratio, a part of an existence that merged with our self-narrative. For example, you have a jacket given to you by someone you love very much. You haven't worn it for a long time, so you store it in your closet. Years later, you see it again, and you feel something familiar, but you can't quite name it. This is duratio that's almost faded away. The memory of it hasn't just disappeared as information, but as an existence in the flow of your time. Spinoza also explains the connection between memory and imagination. If the human body has been affected by two or more things at the same time, then when the mind imagines one of them, it will immediately recall the other as well. Spinoza doesn't sharply distinguish between memory and imagination. Both work in an associative system. When we imagine one thing, we might also recall something else that was with it. So, memory itself is not a fixed reality, but an associative structure in consciousness that can fade or emerge depending on how we bring it back. With Spinoza, we start to understand that forgetting is the loss of connection in the network of existence. It's not just losing data. And since time is the form of the sequence of consciousness, memory is the architecture of the self. What we remember and forget is the disappearance of parts of that structure. In Husserl's thought, memory isn't seen as a data warehouse where past information is stored and then retrieved. Instead, memory is a form of the presentation of time, a way in which the past returns to consciousness. In the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, Husserl distinguishes two important things: retention, the trace of an experience that still lingers in the flow of our consciousness, not yet fully part of the past, like the sound of a note that still echoes a few seconds after it's heard. Recollection or reproduction. The active act of consciousness to bring back a past experience by consciously presenting it into current awareness. But there's one thing that's very distinctive in Husserl's phenomenology. Memory still carries the awareness that what is being brought forward is the past. This distinguishes it from imagination. Memories bring the past as the past, and not just something fictional. This means, in memory, we are aware that the experience has passed. In other words, even though both memory and imagination present something that's not in front of us, only memory includes the dimension of time that has passed. We don't imagine our childhood as fiction. We know it happened, and memory carries the trace of that reality. In the Husserlian framework, memory is not just content, but also an intentional form that expresses, I experienced this, and this is what makes memory existentially important. It's a sign of an experience that has passed but still lives in consciousness. After Spence deconstructed the objectivity of time and emphasized the structure of time in consciousness, Paul Ricoeur came to unite the psychological, philosophical, and historical dimensions of memory. In his book Memory, History, and Forgetting, Ricoeur states that remembering is an act always tied to human efforts to create meaning. Memory is not a tape that gets replayed, but a reconstruction full of effort, shaped by will, influenced by trauma, time, language, and wounds. And in this process, forgetting is not a failure, but part of the whole. He divides it into three. Forgetting as erasure, when traces truly disappear and can no longer be accessed. Forgetting as backup or reverse forgetting, when memories are stored latently, not present now, but can be accessed again. Forgetting that frees, or happy forgetting, forgetting in order to forgive, not to be bound by wounds that never heal, to make space for the present. In one of his most poetic sections, Ricoeur writes, forgetting can be so closely related to memory that it can be considered one of the conditions for memory to occur. This means that without forgetting, we cannot remember healthily. Forgetting gives space to sort, to reorganize, and to reframe the narrative of the self, not to burden with weight. However, this soma turns dark in ways we don't expect, because one of the most terrifying aspects of forgetting is Alzheimer's. As shown in the beginning, it reveals the darker side of it all, the destruction of the self. Here, forgetting is no longer the kindred sibling of memory, but becomes a predator that slowly severs all of humanity's existential networks, memories, language, and the sense of self-presence. Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disorder that gradually erases memory, starting from the recent to the most fundamental. It attacks the core cognitive functions that make humans narrative beings, capable of recognizing themselves as subjects in a continuous life story. But in Alzheimer's, that narrative collapses. What was once coherent becomes meaningless fragments. Experiences lose their place in time and space. The self becomes an empty maze with no exit. Here, Alzheimer's becomes a kind of dark mirror to Ricoeur's thoughts. If in memory, history, forgetting, Ricoeur calls forgetting the condition that allows memory to work, then Alzheimer's shows an extreme condition where memory fails. Not because there's too little forgetting, but because forgetting has taken over the entire system. We can no longer talk about latent memory reserves as Ricoeur meant. What is forgotten is not hidden, but uprooted. It's not forgetting that liberates. but forgetting that cancels. And the most tragic thing, as experts say, is that Alzheimer's sufferers even lose self-recognition, the most fundamental awareness of who they are. When language abilities begin to fade, as Wickstein pointed out, the limitations of my language mean the limitations of my world. The world itself starts to vanish. Memory, which once provided structure to experience and identity, now becomes ruins. Even the body, within the framework of Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, can no longer serve as an extension of the mind. Alzheimer's is not just a disease, but an ontological crisis. It reveals that the self is not a fixed metaphysical entity, but a fragile chain of memory and language associations, all of which can vanish. Thus, Alzheimer's is not only the antithesis of record, but also a warning against any excessive optimism about memory as a tool for creating meaning. It shows that when memory fails completely, we lose everything. Plato, long before Alzheimer's became a term in modern medical dictionaries, anticipated something much deeper: that memory is not a guarantee of truth, and that forgetting is not merely a biological weakness, but the foundation of an epistemological and existential crisis. In many of his dialogues, Plato shows that what we call memory is often actually just a phantom, a shadow of a shadow, an image that seems real but is fragile, easily changed, and full of distortion. In the dialogue Theaetetus, Socrates asks a sharp question. What should we say about forgetting when someone forgets? Doesn't that mean they stop knowing, and when they remember again? Doesn't that mean they return to knowing what they once forgot? This question is not just a logical game, but touches the core of the dilemma of memory, that knowing is not simply storing, but being consciously present to what is known. Forgetting is not just about losing data, but ignorance in disguise. We don't know that we have forgotten, and we think we remember correctly when we don't. Plato distinguishes two forms of representation: icon, the image which is a shadow of the true reality, or eidos, and phantasma, which is imagination or illusion. The image of an image, the form of a form, something that is increasingly distant from the truth. In the context of memory, this means that what we remember is not the reality itself, but only a faint reflection of what once was. And over time, that reflection can be shaped by emotions, by language, by desires. Socrates, in Plato's writings, described memory like a seal on soft wax. If the wax is too hard, the impression doesn't stay. If it's too soft, the image gets blurred. So, the quality of memory depends a lot on the state of the soul, on inner stability, and intellectual capacity to capture and maintain the form. In this sense, Plato actually understood something profound, that memory is not reality, but a construct that can be changed. And even further, that memory loss is not just a personal tragedy, like in Alzheimer's, but also a crisis of truth itself. Who are we if everything we remember is wrong? What is the meaning of the past if memory is just a shadow pretending to be reality? Because if memory can be wrong, can be reconstructed, or even falsified by will, by wounds, by imagination, then the entire narrative that shapes our identity becomes fragile. We build ourselves from fragments that aren't whole, believing that the mosaic formed from them is me. But what if the pieces are flawed? What if the colors aren't real, and the lines have been shifted by time? And when memory fails, like in Alzheimer's, or trauma, or simply from long and tiring time, it's not just that we lose information, we lose continuity. We lose the connection between the past, present, and future. We no longer know who we once loved, what we once fought for, or why we ever felt alive. We lose the narrative that makes life meaningful. That's why, for Plato, memory is not just about what we store in our heads. Memory is about truth. And losing memory is not just losing data, but losing grip on what is true. Forgetting becomes scarier than death, because while death severs life, forgetting severs the meaning of life itself. And at this point, we can ask once more, what remains when everything is forgotten? Is a person still a person if there's no story to tell about them? Does love, suffering, beauty, or even sin still have meaning if there's no trace of it in memory? If I don't forget, am I still me? That's all for this video. Think beyond, be Narian.